This is Classic FM.
So I'm at the Purcell Rooms at the Musical Brain Conference. Very excited to talk to Barry Cooper. Lovely to meet you.
Hello, Nicola.
Hello. Now, you've just discovered the Pange Lingua, which must have been very, very exciting for you. Could you just tell me how you recognise the hymn tune?
Well, it's a plain song, plain chant melody, which I happen to know because I've sung it a few times. And it's a particularly interesting one, actually, because there are several different versions, and I'd looked into this many years ago and noted there were some different versions. So the tune was in the back of my mind. So when I saw it in Beethoven's manuscript, I didn't immediately recognise the first phrase because it's a very ordinary phrase which just goes up and down, looks like. But when I got to about the second or third phrase, I suddenly thought, well, that reminds me of Pange Lingua, and I thought, actually, the rest is Pange Lingua too. So that's how I did it, really, just knowing the tune and looking through Beethoven's sketches rather hard.
Fantastic. Now, you're speaking about Beethoven's text settings in his songs at this weekend's conference. What does the text setting in Pange Lingua tell us about Beethoven himself?
What's happening in Pange Lingua is trying to write a very simple, functional, liturgical piece, not like his elaborate masses or his great symphonies or anything like that, but he can operate at either end of the scale. So you can either operate on a massive scale for a huge work like a Ninth Symphony, or you can operate with something very, very simple. He'd already done this with folk songs. He'd made actually far more folk song settings than any other genre, and people don't always realise that. But when it comes to this plain chant melody, he does the same thing. He makes it very, very simple and pure and solemn and holy sounding. So it's got this very reverent tone to it. On the other hand, that's the way plain song was usually sung in those days. So in some senses, it's not very different from what was normally done. But to our ears, it sounds quite different from our normal experience of Beethoven's music for that reason.
I was actually going to ask you about his folk song settings. I think not many people are aware that he did so many. And how do you think, I mean, obviously they differ from his other works, but how do you think they differ and what do they say about him?
Well, what's so striking is how they differ from anyone else's folk song settings, actually, because I looked at Haydn's and one or two other composers to see how they were doing it. And then I looked at Beethoven's. They're so different. And they're different in a number of ways. One of them is that normally when you get to the end of the first verse, you stop. And then you have a little interlude, and you stop, and then you start again, and you stop at the end of the second verse, and so on. And so it's all sort of stop-start. What Beethoven did was have a little linking bit at the end of each verse. It links into the bit which follows, and then that links into the second verse, and so on. So you get this continual sense of forward thrust, just as you do in his symphonies, of course. And then at the very end, of course, he has an extra little postlude, different from after all the other verses, to give a sense of finality and denouement. So it's highly original.
And there are, in fact, similarities. It's interesting.
Absolutely, it's similarities to his other music, and as I say, so different from even Haydn's settings, so much more imaginative in that sort of way, and also in other ways, and much more energetic settings, because most composers would just sort of set the chords underneath the tune. But Beethoven had this tremendous sense of energy, so lots of rushing semiquavers and energy and figurative accompaniments, which gives it, once again, a much more sense of forward thrust, so again, lots of energy. And the other thing he does is, for the introduction, most composers would just play a little bit of the tune and perhaps decorate it a bit or vary it a bit. What Beethoven does usually is he picks out one crucial motif from the tune and develops that as if it's the beginning of a symphony. And then you don't actually hear the tune itself at first, you just hear little sort of bits of tune developed. And then it's like a bud, and then the flower bursts forth when you hear the whole tune. So it's, again, highly original and yet highly characteristic of Beethoven.
And today is all about, I mean, in many ways, overcoming adversity through music. How do you think music can help people overcome adversity?
Well, in Beethoven's case, he used music he used to use music as a sort of means of creating and overcoming his deafness. Having decided he wanted to carry on with life, he realized that he had so much music in him that he could struggle against, and he was determined to overcome. He has this tremendous sense of energy, battling against difficulty. He was refused to give in to difficulties and adversity. He was always trying to overcome that, and he held a strong spiritual and religious strength as well, which I think supported him in this.
And do you think that's an inspiration for others?
Well, I hope it is, yes. He once said that he hoped that by writing down his adversity, it might help other people in a similar situation. And I think that's precisely what should happen. You see, Beethoven can do this. Well, why can't I do this as well? I can overcome whatever adversity I have.